few months ago, I redesigned an end portal in hardcore Minecraft, and as part of the design, I built 17 original biomes. While I was doing initial designs, I had to scrap a lot of ideas for it to be feasible as a hardcore build. For a few months now, those scrapped ideas have been lingering in the back of my head while I've worked on other projects. Alongside this, I recently played Elden Ring for the first time, and the incredible map design has had me brimming with new ideas. All this led to me starting what is by far my most ambitious project to date. I'm building all the custom biomes from my hardcore world at full scale in one gigantic Minecraft map. This will include new biomes that weren't in the original build, as well as completely unique structures and civilizations for each region. In this video, I will be covering the designing of the map, as well as the first biome, the Copper Forest, which happens to be a personal favourite of mine. So, where do you even begin on a project this big? I have no idea, but drawing a map is probably a good place to start. So I got out my trusty whiteboard and got straight to work drawing a map. Once that was done, I overlaid it onto World Painter and began making a rough outline. I made sure to map out where each biome is going to go, including some hybrid biomes from my original build and new ones as well. All in all, I have 12 biomes planned out for the overworld, with the intention of doing 1 or 2 of them each video. Now, I should mention, a lot of these biomes in terraforming are subject to change. At the time of recording this, I have already redone a few of the regions. I am very much open to any ideas that you may have, so please do leave them in the comments if you have any. Anyway, after about 4 days of map designing, I was left with a pretty solid foundation to work off of. So here's a quick look at what the world looks like as of right now. Now that we have all that out of the way, let's actually start building some stuff. And like any good forest, we're going to start with 16 giant mechanical gears. And by 16, I mean I'm making 4 and rotating them at 30, 45 and 60 degree angles to make the other 12. Using the original build as a reference, I got to work building the copper gears, rotating them at various angles ready to be copy pasted onto the map. I used deep state walls to create this branch-like effect to hold up the gears, almost as if they'd grown out the ground alongside the trees. Sort of similar to the chorus plants in the end. As finicky as it was, making angled variants was absolutely worth the extra time, as it always looks more interesting than a flat build. And after placing down the gears, I decided to move on to the trees. I initially wanted to use the custom trees I built for my hardcore castle, but I quickly realised they kind of suck. So I instead opted to build more detailed trees using actual pine trees as reference. And after finishing the first one, the improvement was pretty clear. This was an incredibly time-consuming process, as I find making custom trees to be pretty challenging, as you will definitely see later. Lastly, I quickly made some boulders and rock formations and began the very long process of placing all of it down. With the surrounding environment done, we can move on to building some structures. Now, the initial plan was to build a water treatment center in the west, a small copper-themed village on a nearby plateau, and a large copper tree in the middle of the biome. I did not plan on doing any more than that, but as per usual, I got a bit carried away. Regardless, I started work on the water treatment center using an actual sedimentation plant as a reference. This did not take particularly long, as it's a pretty basic build, but it's one that I like nonetheless. I made some artificial water streaks using glass panes, and I used a biome brush to make one half the water look toxic and filthy, not too dissimilar to anywhere in Birmingham. Moving on, I planned out some routes for the aqueducts that'll be pulling water coming from the toxic swamp just across the sea. I then began decorating the pipeways and finished up the area with some extra foliage and decorations. Now, we have a village to build, and I got started by laying out some basic rectangular shapes on the ground so I roughly knew what scale I was building with. This is a really helpful method I stole from an incredibly talented YouTuber called Trixie Blocks, who I'm sure you've already heard of because his channel is about 1,000 times larger than mine. Regardless, you should go check him out too. I decided to start work on the only house in this place that was not at an angle because I can get some really nice detail onto a flat build. There was a lot of pressure for me to get this house right as it's the first build and it sort of sets the stage for the rest of the village houses, and I'm actually pretty happy with how it turned out. This village was made to act as an extension of the forest itself, hence the house is being constructed out of dirt, wood and copper. I then constructed a barn for the farms to look after their crops and animals. I decided to place down 2 barns, decorating one of them with mangrove leaves and the other with glowberries. I added some small farmland patches in the gaps between the houses to fill up the space, and then I moved on to one of the more unique builds, the sawmill. I started with a raised stone platform for woodworking, and then I built a tower with a workstation on the bottom floor. I then decided it made sense to add a crane to help lift logs being harvested from the woods below. I think the rest of this section lends itself well to me shutting up for a minute or two, so here's the rest of the village. This tree caused me some problems. Initially, I wanted to make a tree actually made out of copper, but I did some testing and it just looked terrible. I reckon someone with insane talent could make it work, but it wasn't working for me. So I instead opted to build a normal tree with copper leaves. I wanted to use all of the space available to me, so I decided to start by making a gigantic crater to put the tree in, which I then textured using a stone gradient and some grass. This is where the first of 2 main issues came. I made a completely straight trunk for this tree. This is not inherently bad, you can make a tree with a straight trunk look good, but it's a lot harder to make it look interesting. I then moved on to the branches, which is what really killed it for me. By the time I was done, it didn't look terrible, but it just looked round, which is not what I wanted. I decided to try and stick it out by adding on the leaves and seeing how it looked, but it just didn't come together how I wanted it to, and it ended up looking cartoonish, so not great. With about 6 hours of my time down the drain, I decided to play Roblox Squid Game and have another go at the tree the next day. I began the next day by scrapping the first tree and started work on a completely new one using the shadow tree from the Elden Ring DLC as a reference. The shadow tree is actually made up of 2 trees, one that just goes straight up and the other coils around it and branches off to the side. I decided to make a slight alteration to this and make a stone pillar for the tree to wrap around instead of just another tree. I then started creating branches that grew way out to the side and sort of just worked backwards from there. There were a lot of branches and I was going slightly insane. I lost most of the footage of me placing on the leaves, but that doesn't really matter because they ended up being changed anyway. After pasting it into the world, I built another smaller branch coming off the other side to create slightly more balance between the 2 sides. This was a tedious process as I'd been making tree branches for 3 straight days at this point, but I am a lot happier with how it came out. Anyway, after looking back at the initial plan, I realised I checked everything off the list, so I did what any normal person would do and completely ignored it and just started building an observatory. I decided to go with weathered copper as the main colour for the observatory. This place is meant to belong to an esteemed researcher and turquoise sort of just fits that vibe a lot better than a bright shiny orange. I started making a ring of archways across the midsection of the observatory which allowed these really nice light rays to come through at times. Moving on to the interior, I built a very incorrect moon phase diagram on the floor which upon looking at a reference I immediately corrected. In the center of the room, I built a large bookshelf for storing, books, which also acts as a stand for the telescope, which after about 2 hours of trying actually ended up looking like a telescope, which I was quite surprised by. I then filled out the bottom floor with some hanging lights, tables and greenery. I decided it would make sense for the researcher to have a giant satellite dish to monitor signals coming from the far reaches of space. I don't really have much to say about this build, so I'm just going to let it play out. I mentioned in my end portal video that the losing mobs from the mob votes over the years will be included in the biomes. So I'm building this small sanctuary for copper golems. This plateau holds an ancient relic, the last remaining gear from a time in which only copper golems existed in this forest. It sits half buried in the ground and completely oxidized. It was once used as a shelter by the first traveller to ever arrive here, at a time when the forest was barely clinging to life. Hoping to restore life to the forest, the traveller dedicated his days to learning the art of xylokinesis, which is what Google told me is the name for wood manipulation apparently. Eventually, he decided to bind his soul to one of the few remaining saplings in the centre of the forest, at the cost of his own life. The sapling eventually bloomed into a giant tree with leaves of glowing copper, which is a bit much, to be honest with you. Just build a wood farm, or something. Further downstream, there's a shack built by said traveller, which is an homage to my first ever survival house, which I made well over 10 years ago at this point. It is also home to the only default Minecraft tree in this entire forest. After that, I then spent 2 hours building this weird thing and then immediately deleting it. I was planning on leaving it there, but the roots of this tree were kind of just non-existent. So I decided that the final thing I would do would be to fix up the base of the tree. And to make it more interesting, I decided to build a city around the base of the tree to celebrate the newfound life that it brought to the forest. I think I've done enough talking now, so I'm just going to leave this to a time lapse with Minecraft's best music disc in the background. All of these houses are empty, and I think it would be nice to give them all a unique interior, but there are way too many of them for me to want to do that alone. So...
Right, basically, you can do whatever you want with the inside, as long as it is not horrendously inappropriate.
Oh, I can't make a gimp house or something.
They don't have to be hyper detailed, I just want all of them done. Alright, let's go.
Sounds good.
Okay, I don't want to ruin your architecture. Can I make a Satanist tribute room?
Good gracious.
Get out.
Have you done the parkour?
Oh, this is... Oh, that's good parkour, but I actually want to avoid end portals. I don't want there to be any other way to get into the end. What the...
Yeah! Love bunk beds, man. Why did I say that?
It's Binkley Land! I don't like the torches being on these fence posts, but I don't know what else to put them on. Oh, yes.
Edison, put it up on screen right now.
I'm going to set one of these houses up later.
I have a problem with this tree. again. And the problem is that I made all of the leaves basically just giant spheres. So how do you go about fixing this? Well, the answer is very slowly. I took a small sphere brush and I individually shaped each and every single bush on this tree. The key was to make the leaves have a more conical shape, with the overall aim to bring it all together into one large canopy as opposed to just blobs on the end of a stick. I've edited all of this process down into a really concise process and I'm quite proud of it, so I hope you enjoy. At first, it didn't look that different to me and I was getting worried that I just wasted a bunch of time, but after a side-by-side comparison I realised it was definitely worth the many hours I put in. And after all that building, I think it's finally time to take a look at the finished product in its entirety.